Before we start the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any new uploads. The series begins in 1989 in Colombia during a time when drug trafficking was spreading uncontrollably. Drugs were being smuggled from Colombia to the United States, so the U.S. was helping the Colombian police track down the traffickers to get rid of this huge problem. Back then, wiretapping technology was not as advanced as it is today. For example, the U.S. could only tap radio telephones, and even that required an aircraft to fly over the area where the phone signal was coming from to capture it. Another challenge was that even though they could listen to the calls, they couldn't identify who was speaking. That's why the U.S. developed a new voice recognition system to identify callers. Now we move to one of the U.S. security bases in Colombia, where they receive a signal from the phone of a drug trafficker named Poison. They learn that Poison is going to a certain restaurant to meet another trafficker named Lizard. One of the agents on site immediately contacts Steve Murphy, a DEA agent stationed in Colombia. Murphy informs a Colombian officer named Carrillo, and they quickly move in on the restaurant where Poison and Lizard are meeting. The team storms the place, opens fire on everyone inside, and successfully completes the mission. But wait, how did Agent Murphy end up in Colombia, helping the Colombian authorities fight drug lords in the first place? To answer that, we go back to the 1970s in Chile, which was under the rule of dictator Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet was heavily supported by the U.S. because they feared that if he were removed, communists might take over the country. At that time, Chile had become a hub for the production and trafficking of drugs to the U.S. Pinochet cracked down brutally on the drug traffickers. He didn't just arrest them, he had them executed and dumped into mass graves. On one such occasion, after soldiers executed a group of traffickers and left, one of them turned out to still be alive because none of the bullets had hit him. This man was Mateo Moreno, better known as El Cucaracha, the cockroach. The cockroach fled the grave, went home, took his wife, and escaped Chile, heading to Colombia, which had just become the new drug trafficking hub. The cockroach needed a smuggler to move the cocaine he produced to other countries. At the time, there were three major smuggling cartels in Colombia: the Ochoa brothers, Jorge, Juan, and Fabio, who could smuggle anything anywhere in the world, but were extremely expensive. So the cockroach decided not to work with them. The gang led by Jose Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, who was a dangerous man capable of killing anyone without reason. So the cockroach avoided him as well. The last option was the up-and-coming duo, Pablo Escobar and his cousin Gustavo Gaviria. At that time, Pablo and Gustavo were involved in smuggling, but only small goods, like televisions and electronics. One day, while they were transporting goods, they were stopped by Colombian police, led by Captain Herrera. Herrera tried to arrest them, but Pablo wasn't intimidated at all. He told Herrera that he knew everything about him and his men, even their families, and warned that if they didn't let him go, he would have them all killed. Realizing that Pablo was not to be messed with, Herrera decided to let them go, and even started working with Pablo in exchange for bribes to allow his shipments to pass freely. That same night, Pablo and Gustavo met the cockroach, who told them he produced cocaine and wanted them to smuggle it to Peru, where it sold for $10 per gram. Pablo thought for a moment and said, "You sell it for $10 a gram in Peru, right? What if I could get it into Miami? How much do you think you could sell it for there?" The cockroach was amazed, because smuggling to Miami meant far more profit. From that moment on, they decided to smuggle cocaine to the U.S. instead of Peru. Meanwhile, in Miami, Agent Murphy and his partner Kevin were working for the DEA, focusing mainly on marijuana smuggling at the time. We see them chasing down a small-time marijuana dealer and arresting him easily. Later, they celebrate at a casino, where Kevin plays a prank on Murphy by telling him that a girl nearby likes him. Murphy, embarrassed, approaches her and asks for her number, but she turns him down. To save face, Murphy goes back and asks her to just write down any number so he could show Kevin. Surprisingly, she writes her real number, and that encounter eventually leads to their marriage. Back in South America, Pablo and Gustavo visit the cockroach in Peru, who had a small lab producing cocaine. Pablo began transporting the product to Colombia and then smuggling it to the U.S. As business expanded, Pablo bought a house in Colombia and brought the cockroach there to work closer to him. We see Pablo at home with his wife Tata and his mother, who is sewing a custom jacket with secret pockets to hide cocaine for smuggling. Soon, Gustavo arrives with a man named Leon, who will take the jacket and smuggle the cocaine into the U.S. In the U.S., Leon works with Larry, who distributes the cocaine there. As business boomed, they needed more people, pilots, women, and others, to move the product. Eventually, they even started hiding cocaine in food shipments like potatoes and coffee. Later, Larry tells Pablo and Gustavo that he bought a private plane that can carry over 1,300 kilograms of cocaine to Miami in one trip. Everyone is thrilled, and the empire grows even bigger. As production increases, Pablo sets up hidden cocaine labs deep in the jungle. When Pablo visits one of the jungle labs, the cockroach complains that he's being underpaid and sidelined despite introducing Pablo to the cocaine trade. Pablo, annoyed, begins to distrust the cockroach. Later, Pablo makes deals with both El Mexicano and one of the Ochoa brothers to smuggle their cocaine to Miami, taking a 35% cut from each shipment. This deal floods Miami with cocaine, sparking violent shootouts between dealers and law enforcement. During one such incident, Murphy kills a teenage dealer in self-defense, but is deeply troubled by it. Back in Colombia, the cockroach tries to renegotiate for a higher cut with Gustavo, but Gustavo warns him to back off. Meanwhile, Captain Herrera, despite his deal with Pablo, starts seizing Pablo's shipments. Pablo confronts him furiously and is photographed during the confrontation. This mugshot would later haunt Pablo as it officially registered his face in police records. Herrera then demands $1 million per shipment instead of $150,000, claiming the shipments are worth $5 million each. Pablo suspects an insider leaked the shipment's value to Herrera and offers him more money if he reveals the informant's name. Herrera admits that it was the cockroach who leaked the information and was also secretly smuggling his own cocaine to Miami. Furious, Pablo decides to eliminate the cockroach. In Miami, we see Murphy and Kevin undercover, setting up a sting to arrest a dealer named Herman, who turns out to be the cockroach's man in Miami. Just as they're about to arrest him, two gunmen on a motorcycle, sent by Pablo, burst in and open fire, killing both Kevin and Herman. Murphy kills one of the gunmen and captures the other, La Cuica, who is later released on a $2 million bail paid by Pablo. Shattered by his partner's death and frustrated by the injustice, Murphy relocates with his wife to Colombia to bring down Pablo. And that's how Murphy ended up working alongside the Colombian police, leading to the opening scene of the series, where he and Carrillo take down Poison and Lizard. After that operation, Murphy goes to the crime scene to photograph everything for evidence. Meanwhile, Pablo learns that Poison and Lizard were killed, and that an American DEA agent named Murphy is involved. Feeling threatened, he orders Gustavo to put a $500,000 bounty on Murphy's head. We jump back in time again to see what Murphy did from the moment he first arrived in Colombia. Murphy and his wife Connie are shown on a plane headed to Colombia. During this same period, Pablo Escobar's empire was expanding at an unbelievable rate. One of the biggest drug lords working with Pablo even bought a huge island in the Bahamas and turned it into a refueling and rest station for smuggling planes. Meanwhile, Pablo and Gustavo kept growing their operations, building more and more cocaine labs. They even brought in German scientists to improve the quality of the product and hide it more effectively. The scientists managed to conceal cocaine in places no one could imagine, even inside Coca-Cola bottles, so that it would never be detected. For example, we see Pablo with the Mexican trafficker near a boat that they know is carrying cocaine. The Mexican brings a sniffer dog to find the drugs, but the dog smells nothing because the cocaine is hidden between the layers of the boat's glass hull. The Mexican goes crazy when he realizes his dog can't detect it. Gustavo then tells Pablo that they're making so much money they can't launder it all. Pablo promises he'll find a solution. First, he sets up a small taxi company to launder some of the cash, but the money is far too much to clean through just one or two small businesses. So Pablo decides on a crazy idea: burying the cash in secret locations that only he and his closest people know. They start doing exactly that. But as they say, news never stays hidden. Stories about Pablo's wealth and the drug lord's fortune spread all over Colombia. At the same time, we're introduced to the M19 Group, an armed communist organization led by Ivan the Terrible. These people were notoriously reckless. At one point, they even stormed a museum and stole the legendary sword of Simón Bolívar, the liberator of Colombia. When M19 learned about how rich the drug traffickers had become, they decided to kidnap Marta Ochoa, the sister of the Ochoa brothers, Pablo's powerful allies, planning to demand a huge ransom for her release. They carried out the kidnapping successfully. Coincidentally, Murphy and Connie arrived in Colombia the same day Marta was kidnapped. At the airport, when the staff realized they were Americans, they detained them for a while. Eventually, a corrupt police officer arrived and asked Murphy about his job. Murphy explained that he was assigned to the U.S. Embassy. The officer checked his passport to verify his identity, then later passed Murphy's passport information to the drug lords so they could know every U.S. agent in Colombia. Around this time, we see Pablo appearing on television in an interview with a journalist named Valerie. He presents himself as a successful businessman and philanthropist. Pablo is trying to polish his public image because he plans to enter politics. Keep an eye on Valerie. She grows very close to Pablo and becomes important later. Meanwhile, we meet Javier Peña, a DEA agent already stationed in Colombia and working out of the U.S. Embassy. We see Javier with a woman named Helena, who is connected to the drug traffickers. Javier promises to help Helena move to the U.S., her lifelong dream, in exchange for valuable information. The next day at the embassy, Javier meets Murphy for the first time. From that moment, they become partners with one common goal: to capture the drug traffickers, especially Pablo. Later, Murphy and Javier learn that the traffickers are meeting at a certain hotel. They bring in Colonel Carrillo and set up surveillance there, photographing all the dealers, including Pablo. More importantly, during that meeting, Pablo gathers the Mexican, the Ochoa brothers, and other traffickers to announce that he is forming his own criminal organization to unite them all. He promises protection and leadership in exchange for their loyalty. Everyone agrees. From that moment, Pablo becomes the de facto leader of nearly all the drug traffickers in Colombia. He names the organization MAS, Death to Kidnappers, and their first mission is to target the M19 group to force them to release Marta Ochoa. After the meeting, There's a party with many guests, including Helena. Unfortunately, the Mexican trafficker becomes attracted to Helena and approaches her. She tries to extract information from him, but he senses something suspicious. He hands her over to his men, who torture her. Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo are waiting for Helena to report back, but she never returns. Javier, who had developed feelings for her, decides to rescue her himself. He asks Murphy to stay behind while he goes with Carrillo and a team of soldiers to the hotel where the Mexicans' men are. They raid the place, kill the traffickers, and save Helena. Meanwhile, Pablo keeps his promise to the Ochoas. He unleashes his men against M19, massacring many of them. One day, Ivan the Terrible arrives at his base to find all his men slaughtered, with a note beside them. "Return Marta safely, or you and your families will all die." Frightened, Ivan returns Marta to the Ochoas. Later, Ivan goes to Pablo in person with Bolivar's legendary sword and begs Pablo to kill him, but spare his family. Pablo surprises him. He takes the sword as a gift, but promises not to harm Ivan or his family. In fact, Pablo even decides to employ Ivan in his organization. When Gustavo later asks Pablo what role Ivan will play, Pablo simply says he'll reveal it at the right time. From that moment on, Pablo's reputation as the head of mass spreads across Colombia. Back to Murphy and Connie. They return home one day and notice a suspicious man leaving their building, but they ignore it. When they enter their apartment, they find it completely trashed. Everything is smashed, and Connie's pet cat has been killed. Murphy realizes this is a warning from the traffickers to back off. The next day, Murphy reports the incident to Javier, who immediately suspects the airport staff leaked their information to the traffickers. Javier and Murphy inform the U.S. ambassador in Colombia, who tells them that a corrupt officer named Suarez might be able to help them identify who broke into Murphy's home. Javier and Murphy meet Suarez and bribe him for information. Suarez interrogates the airport workers. Through threats and rough treatment, he learns they passed Murphy's details to a man named Poison. Yes, Poison, the same trafficker we saw earlier, who is still alive at this point. Murphy and Javier now decide to go after Poison. Meanwhile, Pablo grows closer to Valerie and confides in her about his ambition to enter politics to gain immunity and further his charitable work for the poor, a cause he genuinely cares about because of his own humble background. Valerie uses her connections to arrange a meeting between Pablo and a lawyer named Duque, who represents the ruling Liberal Party. Duque strikes a deal with Pablo. He'll introduce him to the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara, in exchange for $30 million. Lara, in turn, was to receive a $3 million donation to fund the ministry's projects. However, Lara is an honest man. At first, he refuses the money, calling Pablo a drug trafficker. But Duque eventually persuades Lara that Pablo could help the country's economy, so Lara reluctantly agrees to support Pablo's candidacy and accepts the funding for government projects. Later, Pablo sends Poison and some of his men to deliver the promised $3 million to Lara. At the same time, Carrillo, Murphy, and Javier, who have been tapping Poison's phone, learn about the meeting and set up an ambush to arrest him. Unfortunately, their plan is leaked because Suarez, the corrupt officer, tips off Pablo in exchange for cash. Pablo calls Poison and tells him to turn back immediately. As a result, the ambush fails. Poison escapes and the agents capture no one. Pablo continues building his political image, holding rallies where he hands out money to the poor to boost his popularity. Valerie and his wife Tata both attend one of these rallies. Tata notices the chemistry between Pablo and Valerie, and later warns Pablo to stay away from her. Pablo reassures Tata that he isn't being unfaithful. Soon after, Tata goes into labor, and Pablo rushes her to the hospital. Gustavo visits Pablo there and urges him to give up politics and focus on his family and business. Pablo is annoyed, but says nothing. Tata gives birth to a baby girl, and Pablo is overjoyed. Meanwhile, the Mexican trafficker complains to the Ochoa brothers that Pablo has become too focused on politics while neglecting the business. The Ochoas share his frustration, but are too afraid to act against Pablo. That night, Pablo tells his lieutenant leader that he will replace Gustavo as the manager of the cocaine labs because he is upset with Gustavo. Pablo then asks Leader whether the Mexican and the Ochoas resent his political ambitions. Leader admits they do, but promises to handle the situation. Under Leader's management, cocaine production soars. At the U.S. Embassy, the ambassador tells Murphy and Javier that they must stop Pablo from entering Congress by proving he's a criminal. Murphy and Javier start digging into Pablo's past and learn from Suarez that Pablo had once been arrested for smuggling years ago. Remember the arrest by Captain Herrera. Suarez also gives them the names of officers who were involved in that old case so they can gather evidence. But since Suarez is corrupt, he sells the same information to Pablo, allowing Pablo's men to eliminate anyone who could testify against him. With no other leads, Murphy and Javier decide their best chance is to obtain Pablo's old mugshot from that arrest to publicly expose him as a criminal. They track down the photographer who took the picture, place him in witness protection, and get the photo. Murphy and Javier present the mugshot to Minister Lara, who, being an honest man, decides to expose Pablo. Time passes, and the elections are held. Surprisingly, Pablo loses. However, he pressures the winner to step aside, effectively taking the seat himself and becoming a member of Congress. On the day of the first parliamentary session, Pablo walks in, thrilled to have achieved his lifelong dream. But his joy is shattered when Lara stands up and publicly denounces him as a drug trafficker, showing everyone the incriminating mugshot. Humiliated, Pablo leaves the chamber without saying a word. From then on, Pablo launches a media war against Lara, accusing him of racism and corruption, while Lara retaliates by exposing more drug traffickers who pretend to be legitimate businessmen. Lara's campaign succeeds. He even reveals that the Mexican trafficker owns a major sports club as a front for laundering drug money. Lara's revelations hurt not only the Mexican and the Ochoas, but also Pablo himself. The Colombian government, fearing for Lara's safety, decides to appoint him ambassador to Czechoslovakia to get him out of harm's way. But Pablo, furious over Lara's actions, decides to take revenge before Lara can leave the country. On the day Lara is scheduled to depart, Pablo appears on television. Everyone knew that Lara had given up his seat in the Senate and didn't want any political position anymore. He just wanted to retire from politics peacefully, without any problems or revenge. But of course, Pablo's words weren't true. We then see Lara driving to the airport to leave the country, that suddenly Pablo's men ambush him, open fire, and kill him in a very tragic scene. Murphy and Javier witness what happened and feel guilty because they believe they were the reason Lara ended up in this situation. He was an honest man. From that moment, Murphy decides he won't drag any more decent people into this dirty war. As sad as Lara's death was, it also had a positive side. One of the killers was captured and confessed that Pablo Escobar had ordered the assassination. Because of that, Pablo became officially wanted by the authorities. Also, Colombia signed an agreement with the United States that allowed the extradition of anyone accused of drug trafficking to be tried in the U.S. This terrified all drug lords, since they would have no influence or protection there. We then see Pablo, meeting with the Mexican, Gustavo, Lidier, and the Ochoa brothers. They realize they must fight by all means against extradition to the U.S. The Mexican hires a group of mercenaries for protection. Lidier goes on the radio, appearing in many programs to speak against the extradition campaign. Meanwhile, the Ochoa brothers hire a public relations company to launch a massive campaign against extradition. Pablo, however, chooses a completely different approach. He starts sending threatening letters to well-known politicians, warning them not to support extradition. Otherwise, they and their families would be killed. One of the people he sent a letter to was Galan, the presidential candidate. Pablo also threatened judges, warning them not to approve extradition rulings. This led judges to wear masks during trials to hide their identities. But Pablo still managed to discover who they were and had them killed. Amid all this, something unexpected happens. Representatives of the U.S. Army and the CIA in Colombia hold a meeting with the Ambassador Murphy and Javier. They inform them that the U.S. president has decided to reduce funding for the DEA because the priority is to support the Army and intelligence services to fight communists, considered the real threat at the time. The DEA's budget for Colombia would be cut down to just $100,000 a year. Javier and Murphy decide to make the best use of the limited funds. Javier approaches a Colombian police general named Hermí, offers him the $100,000 as a bribe, and asks him to appoint Carrillo to lead the hunt for Pablo. Hermí agrees, and Javier is satisfied because he knows Carrillo is a good, tough officer who can really help them capture Pablo. Carrillo wastes no time. He takes Murphy and Javier to interrogate one of Pablo's men who had been previously arrested. Under torture, the man reveals Pablo's exact location. Carrillo immediately leads a large police force, along with Javier and Murphy, to raid the place. But Pablo gets wind of the raid just in time, and he escapes. Gustavo stays behind to burn any evidence that could incriminate them, and then they all flee the house on a private plane. When Murphy, Javier, and the police arrive, they find no one there. However, among the burnt evidence, they discover a half-burned paper with an address on it. They follow it and find it belongs to Pablo's accountant, known as Blackbeard. The police arrest him and seize over 6,000 documents and files that could incriminate Pablo. But these documents are sent to the Supreme Court in Colombia. Hermí refuses to let Murphy or Javier take any of the evidence, claiming it belongs to the state. In truth, Hermí is just bitter about receiving such a small bribe. Murphy, however, manages to secretly steal one document. It shows a money transfer to a man named Cecil. Murphy and Javier go to Suarez to ask about Cecil and learn that he is a former American pilot who now works illegally for Pablo, smuggling drugs. Murphy then goes to a U.S. intelligence officer, shows him Cecil's picture, and learns his address. Murphy and Javier quickly arrest Cecil. Cecil offers to cooperate and testify against Pablo in exchange for immunity. They agree, and Cecil gives them a photograph. The photo shows Pablo Escobar in Nicaragua, smuggling drugs alongside members of the Nicaraguan Communist Council, revealing they were involved in the drug trade. You might wonder how this photo could help. Well, Murphy gives it to the U.S. ambassador, who sends it to Washington. The revelation spreads widely, and because the U.S. president strongly opposed the communists, he decides to launch a massive campaign against both the communists and the drug traffickers, seeing them as allies. As a result, Murphy and Javier receive unprecedented support, more weapons, money, and resources to go after Pablo. Thanks to this, they manage to locate and destroy many of Pablo's laboratories. In one of these labs, they capture Lidier, who is extradited to the U.S. and sentenced to 13,335 years in prison. After these events, Pablo meets again with the Mexican Gustavo and the Ochoa brothers, declaring that the war has begun and he will not back down. Meanwhile, we see Javier and Murphy at a restaurant when Connie, Murphy's wife, arrives with her friend Elisa, a nurse at the hospital where Connie works. Unknown to them, Elisa is secretly a member of the M19 communist group. Elisa befriends them casually. Later that night, Pablo meets with Ivan, the leader of M19, and offers him a lot of money in exchange for carrying out a major operation against the government. Ivan agrees. Elisa eventually becomes Ivan's partner. When she learns about the deal, she feels it's wrong. The next day, she confides in Connie, revealing her secret affiliation with M19 and asks Connie to take her to an American officer to warn them about what's about to happen. Connie agrees and takes her to Javier. Elisa tells Javier everything she knows, and he immediately calls Murphy. They realize Ivan and his group are planning something disastrous that very day. Murphy rushes to inform the ambassador, but before he can, the news breaks. M19 militants have stormed the Colombian Supreme Court, killing dozens of people, including judges and officers. The army tries to retake the building. This attack wasn't random. Pablo ordered M19 to do it to destroy the 6,000 incriminating documents against him. They succeed in burning all the evidence, leaving nothing to tie Pablo to his crimes. Murphy and Javier attend a meeting with the ambassador, the army, and intelligence representatives, trying to convince them that Pablo orchestrated the attack. But no one listens, and they decide to focus solely on fighting the communists. Murphy and Javier keep Elisa's involvement a secret to protect her from arrest. On the other side, Pablo and his men meet Ivan and his fighters, supposedly to pay them. But Pablo kills them all to silence them forever. Later, the presidential candidate Galan gives a speech vowing to fight the drug cartels. His aide, Cesar, watches closely. Realizing Galan is making dangerous enemies, keeps Cesar in mind for later events. Meanwhile, Javier grows close to Elisa and starts falling for her. He decides to smuggle her out of Colombia to protect her from both the drug cartels, who want her dead, and the U.S. military and intelligence, who also want to kill her because she's a communist. The next day, they meet with Murphy to plan Elisa's escape. Later, during a meeting with the ambassador, the army, and intelligence officials, they are ordered to hand over the informant, Elisa, so she can be prosecuted. Murphy and Javier refuse, angering the officials, who then vow to track her down themselves. Murphy and Javier later reveal to the group that Pablo and the other cartel leaders are hiding in Panama under the protection of the Panamanian president, Noriega. No one believes them, as Noriega is an ally of the U.S. president. But they're right. Pablo and his associates are indeed in Panama, planning their next move. Most of Pablo's men prefer to stay in Panama until things calm down in Colombia, before returning. But Pablo tells his wife Tata that he's determined to return to Colombia, even if it means starting a war. His first step to regain control in Colombia is to eliminate Galan, so he can influence the next presidential candidate to oppose extradition. Pablo Escobar's plan to return to Colombia depended on stopping extradition to the U.S. He believed that if the next president opposed extradition, he and his allies could safely return. So that same night, while presidential candidate Galan was giving a speech, gunmen opened fire and killed him. The next day, Galan's funeral was held. His family, Cesar, and many others attended. During the farewell speech, Galan's son asked Cesar to run in his father's place. Cesar decided to run for president. The moment Cesar announced his candidacy, Pablo, The Mexicano, the Ochoa brothers, and the others boarded a plane back to Colombia. After returning, Pablo met with Duca and Valeria and sent them to convince Cesar to oppose extradition to the U.S. They warned Cesar that refusing would mean he'd be killed just like Galan. Cesar was angered by the threat and dismissed them, but he started thinking seriously about how to handle Pablo. Meanwhile, Javier received a visit in his office from the U.S. military representative, who revealed they had captured a member of the M19 guerrilla group. They planned to torture him until he admitted that Elisa had helped Murphy and Javier. If that happened, Elisa would be prosecuted. Javier was shaken, so he went to a U.S. embassy staffer and asked her to forge travel papers for Elisa, so she could be smuggled out of the country. At the same time, the U.S. military rep continued torturing the captured guerrilla until he confessed Elisa's involvement. The military rep became determined to arrest her. Elsewhere, Carrillo stayed focused on his mission, wiretapping Pablo's phones. One day, while dining in a restaurant with his wife, one of Pablo's hitmen burst in and opened fire, trying to kill Carrillo. But Carrillo shot the man dead instead. Furious, Carrillo called Pablo directly, telling him he knew his family's whereabouts, just as Pablo knew his. He warned that if Pablo targeted his family again, he would retaliate in kind. Enraged, Pablo decided to escalate the war against the police and the state. He met with the Mexicano, who revealed his own plan to buy powerful missiles to attack the police and army. A man named Hartenia, the Mexicano's assistant, overheard their conversation. Later, Hartenia secretly met with Murphy and Javier and offered to give them the Mexicano's location in exchange for protection and money. Murphy and Javier reported the information to the U.S. ambassador. She ordered Javier to go after the Mexicano, while Murphy was tasked with staying behind to protect Cesar, who was scheduled to appear at an important political rally. Before leaving, Javier handed Murphy the forged papers so he could help Elisa escape. Meanwhile, the Mexicano went to a city to buy missiles and even tested one. At Cesar's upcoming rally, he initially planned to oppose extradition. But during his speech, he had a change of heart. Overcome by conscience, he publicly declared that, if elected, he would cooperate with the U.S. and extradite all drug traffickers. His words ignited an all-out war between the government and the cartels. The violence began within days. Poison, one of Pablo's men, encountered a police checkpoint and gunned down 2 officers. He called Pablo to report what he had done. Pablo, pleased, ordered that anyone who killed a police officer would receive a hefty cash reward. This marked the start of a massacre that claimed the lives of more than 200 police officers. Murphy, meanwhile, prepared to smuggle Elisa out of the country, but discovered a listening device in his car, proof the military was spying on him. He used the bug to mislead them. When the U.S. military rep stopped Murphy's car later, hoping to catch Elisa, he found nothing. Elisa had already left the country safely with Connie's help. With Elisa safe, Murphy returned to focus on Pablo. He met with Cesar and his bodyguard Eduardo, offering his support and protection. Soon after, Murphy received a photo from an informant of a newly arrived Spaniard in Colombia. The man had been greeted personally by Poison, clear evidence he was important to Pablo. Murphy decided to investigate. At the same time, the Spaniard was meeting with Pablo and Gustavo. They revealed they wanted him to build a bomb in exchange for 3,000 kilos of cocaine. The Spaniard initially refused, but Pablo pressured him until he agreed. Gustavo, however, grew increasingly disillusioned with Pablo's methods and confided in Marta, the Ochoa brothers' sister, whom he secretly loved. She suggested they run away together, but he refused. Murphy tried to learn more about the Spaniard's identity. He went to Suarez, but Suarez refused to talk, saying he only dealt with Javier. Frustrated, Murphy forced the information out of him. Murphy then went to the U.S. Embassy, met with the ambassador, the military and intelligence reps, and told them he believed Pablo had brought the Spaniard to build a bomb to assassinate Caesar. He requested access to intelligence files. After digging through records, he found evidence confirming the Spaniard's expertise in explosives. Murphy and the ambassador warned Caesar and Eduardo, urging them to postpone travel plans until the Spaniard was caught. But Caesar refused, determined to continue his campaign. Meanwhile, the Spaniard finished building the bomb, hiding it inside a tape recorder. Pablo's men then recruited a young associate named Jaime, instructing him to board a plane carrying Caesar and to record his speech. Without knowing, the recorder was actually a bomb. As usual, Suarez tipped off Pablo about Murphy's investigation. Enraged by the betrayal, Pablo sent poison to kill Suarez. A few days later at the airport, Jaime boarded the plane with the recorder, still unaware of what it was. Before takeoff, Murphy rushed to warn Cesar, convincing him not to board. The plane took off without Cesar, and moments later, the bomb detonated, killing Jaime and everyone else on board. Elsewhere, Javier and Carrillo finally tracked down the Mexicano. In the ensuing confrontation, the Mexicano grabbed his young son, Freddy, and tried to escape while his men held off the police. A chase ensued, and in the end, both the Mexicano and his son were killed, marking Carrillo's first major victory against the cartels. The plane bombing, which claimed the lives of over 107 people, transformed Pablo Escobar into one of the world's most wanted terrorists. He became the #1 target for U.S. authorities. Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo later visited Natalie, the widow of young Jaime who unknowingly carried the bomb. They urged her to cooperate, explaining that Pablo would likely kill her and her daughter to cover his tracks. But terrified, Natalie refused to speak. Pablo, meanwhile, sent his family into hiding for safety and ordered poison to kill Natalie to eliminate any loose ends. In the meantime, Cesar won the presidential election. At his celebratory event, he spoke with former Colombian President Turbe, asking for advice. Turbe warned him never to trust the Americans because they could easily betray him. Cesar agreed and later acted on this advice. The following day, he invited the U.S. ambassador, Murphy, Javier, and representatives of the military and intelligence to a meeting, announcing his first major decision as president. So now, he keeps chasing Pablo and won't let him go, but he asks them to stop searching for Pablo all over the country because that's not their jurisdiction. And after that meeting, we see the army and police keep raiding Pablo's production sites, hoping to catch him there. But thanks to the huge number of informants Pablo has recruited, he easily escapes every time. Pablo doesn't stay silent about that. He starts bombing many vital places in the country as a response to what Cesar is doing. Also, because of the pressure he's under, Pablo takes his men and goes to meet a cartel boss named Pacho and asks him to partner up to smuggle drugs together. But Pacho refuses for several reasons, the biggest one being that he's arrogant and really hates Pablo. Pablo can't accept that, so he threatens to kill him and leaves. We then see that Pacho decides to create problems for Pablo. One day, he meets his brother Ocho, and they discover that their sister is in love with Gustavo, and Gustavo feels the same way. They've been seeing each other secretly for a long time. Since Gustavo is Pablo's cousin, everyone is shocked, and we still don't know what they plan to do about their sister. Meanwhile, Pablo sends Duque to meet Cesar, hoping to make a deal. Pablo would stop the bombings, and in return, Cesar would stop going after Pablo's men and raiding his warehouses. But Cesar refuses. Duque reports everything to Pablo, which makes Pablo furious. Later, Pablo sits down with Gustavo to figure out what to do. Gustavo tells him the only solution is to kidnap very important people in the country to pressure Cesar into agreeing to negotiations. Pablo agrees, and his men start kidnapping the families of politicians, celebrities, and so on. We see that journalist Valeria is always the first to arrive at these events to cover them, often because Pablo tips her off. One day, while Valeria is covering a kidnapping, a famous TV host who happens to be the daughter of former President Tobar shows up and subtly accuses Valeria of having some kind of connection to Pablo. Valeria gets angry and goes to Pablo, asking him to kidnap Tobar's daughter as well, saying it would even benefit him since she's very famous. Pablo agrees and orders his men to kidnap Tobar's daughter and keep her in a secret location. At some point, Pablo brings her in and wants to record a video of her saying she's fine to use it as leverage to pressure President Cesar into negotiating with him. The girl reluctantly agrees, and the video is broadcast everywhere. Cesar, Tobar, and his wife all see it. Tobar urges Cesar to negotiate with Pablo to save his daughter, and even threatens to cut off financial support and ruin Cesar's image in the media. Cesar, upset by all this, thinks it over and eventually decides to negotiate with Pablo. Later, Pablo takes Gustavo to a place in the mountains and tells him he plans to build a fortress there, a secure stronghold to protect himself from the police and anyone else. He also says this fortress will be part of his deal with Cesar. Gustavo is thrilled and fully supports the idea. On the other side, Poison and two hitmen go looking for Natalia to kill her, but they don't find her because she's hiding with a friend along with her little daughter. Eventually, Poison and the two hitmen manage to find Natalia and kill her and her friend. Poison is about to kill Natalia's daughter too, but he doesn't get the chance because Murphy and Javier, who have been monitoring the situation, arrive just in time, causing Poison and his men to flee. Unfortunately, they escape. Murphy and Javier find the little girl and take her to Murphy's wife, Connie, deciding to raise her together. About a week later, we see Pablo and Gustavo moving through the jungle on their way to meet Cesar. But the police ambush them and open fire. They barely escape. Pablo realizes Cesar is trying to capture him before they reach any agreement, so he decides to teach him a lesson. Pablo goes back to Tobar's daughter and asks her to record another video, this time urging Cesar to accept negotiations, or else she and the other hostages will be killed. She complies and records the video, but Cesar isn't swayed and still tries to capture Pablo. At one point, U.S. intelligence manages to intercept a call from the location where Tobar's daughter is held. Carrillo and his team raid the place, intending to rescue her, but by mistake, they kill her. A funeral is held for her, and during the ceremony, her mother pleads with Cesar to accept Pablo's terms, warning that otherwise, all the hostages will face the same fate. Moved by this, Cesar finally agrees to Pablo's conditions. Eduardo informs Murphy, Javier, and the U.S. ambassador that the president has decided to accept Pablo's deal. This includes Pablo publicly admitting to being a drug trafficker and serving a very light prison sentence, in a prison he built himself in the mountains, guarded by his own men with the police kept far away. Everyone feels that Pablo has imposed his will on the president, but Eduardo argues it's the only way to end the chaos. Pablo gathers Duque, Valeria, and Gustavo to celebrate the news. Later, he tells Duque that this isn't the end of their work. Duque's job now is to try to reduce Pablo's already light sentence even further. Valeria tells Pablo she has to distance herself from him once he officially becomes a convicted drug trafficker, as staying close to him would harm her as a journalist. Pablo tells her he understands, but knows she will always be drawn to him. Pablo then talks to Gustavo, revealing that he knows about Gustavo's relationship with Marta, the Ocho brothers' sister, and tells him to end it to avoid trouble with them. Gustavo says he'll think about it. Pablo then calls in two of his trusted men, Fernando and Kiko, and tells them that while he and Gustavo are in prison, they will be responsible for running the business. He assures them that he and Gustavo will still be in touch constantly. Grateful for the trust, they agree. Meanwhile, Carrillo meets with Javier and Murphy and insists they must capture Pablo and Gustavo before the deal with Cesar becomes official. Otherwise, they'll never get another chance. Murphy and Javier agree. At the same time, Pacho meets with Valeria and tries to turn her against Pablo to work with him. She doesn't give a definite answer. Pacho hints that he'll get rid of Pablo soon, but doesn't say how or when. That very night, while Pablo is at home with his wife Tata, a bomb explodes in the house. Luckily, neither Pablo nor Tata is harmed. Pablo rushes to check on his son and finds him safe, but his little daughter suffers an ear injury that leaves her deaf in one ear. Furious, Pablo wants to know who did this and who betrayed his location. The next day, the Ocho brothers receive a photo of Gustavo with their sister Marta, confirming their suspicions about the affair. Enraged, they go to Pacho and ask for his help in negotiating a deal similar to Pablo's. They'll confess their crimes and serve a short sentence in exchange for turning Gustavo over to the police before the deal with Cesar is finalized. Pacho is delighted and helps them. Soon after, the Ocho brothers reveal everything to the police, including Gustavo's whereabouts. Later, Gustavo goes to a hotel with Marta, but suddenly Carrillo and his men ambush him. Carrillo tells Gustavo that arresting him is technically illegal because the president has forbidden them from targeting him or Pablo. Carrillo gives Gustavo a choice: reveal Pablo's location or die. Gustavo refuses, so Carrillo orders his men to beat him to death in a shocking scene. News of Gustavo's death devastates Pablo and his family. Pablo vows to wage war on everyone. A few days later, Valeria tells Pablo that the Ocho brothers betrayed Gustavo and that Pacho helped them. Enraged, Pablo orders his men to kill Pacho. We see Pacho playing a soccer match with friends when Pablo's gunmen storm the field and open fire. Pacho manages to escape unharmed by sheer luck. The next day, the news announces that Colombia's Congress has decided not to extradite drug traffickers to the U.S., exactly what Pablo wanted all along. Feeling victorious, Pablo holds a funeral for Gustavo the same day. Later, Eduardo arrives by plane and delivers the signed deal from Cesar. Pablo signs it, surrenders, and is taken to his self-built prison. On the same day, Murphy receives intel that poison is at a restaurant, along with many of Pablo's hitmen. Murphy immediately sends Carrillo and his team, who storm the place and kill everyone. This is the same scene the series began with. Meanwhile, Pablo settles into his prison, living comfortably. A truck delivers whatever he wants every day, driven by a man named Basia. Remember that name. One day, one of Pablo's men, Velasco, visits him and tells him that Pacho wants to make peace. Pablo agrees but demands that Pacho first execute a group of his own new men as punishment. Velasco agrees to relay the message. Later, Pacho, furious over the deaths of his men, meets with Fernando and Kiko, who run Pablo's operations. They tell Pacho that Pablo is willing to make peace but demands $12 million. Pacho, annoyed, offers $10 million instead. Fernando and Kiko report this to Pablo, but he's dissatisfied and demands $30 million plus a monthly payment of $1 million instead of $250,000, in addition to most of the business profits. Unhappy but unwilling to provoke Pablo, Fernando and Kiko agree. Meanwhile, Carrillo, before transferring to Spain, gives Javier and Murphy a photo of Pablo's prison, proving it's not a real prison, and urges them to keep gathering evidence to show that Pablo is violating the deal so they can transfer him to a real prison. Javier and Murphy agree, and later with the army and intelligence study aerial photos of the prison. They notice a pigeon tower and realize Pablo is using carrier pigeons to send messages outside. The next day, Javier and Murphy monitor the prison and catch a pigeon carrying a message that says, "Send the supplies with Basia through the tunnel." That night, they wonder what the tunnel refers to, then realize it's not a literal tunnel, but code for the truck route. The next day, they intercept Basia's truck and install hidden cameras and microphones inside to record everything being smuggled in. Day after day, the footage shows the truck carrying alcohol, women, toys, and all kinds of contraband for Pablo. Eduardo's assistant tells Cesar they need to transfer Pablo to a real prison, but Cesar refuses, fearing Pablo will resume terrorist attacks. One day, Pablo celebrates his birthday in prison with his family. Among the guests is Kiko's wife, who complains to Pablo about the increased payments. Pablo grows suspicious of Kiko. Soon after, Velasco tells Pablo that a farmer working on land owned by Fernando and Kiko discovered $3 million buried there. Velasco suggests that they had stolen the money from Pablo and buried it on the farm. Pablo believes him. Though it's not true, the money had been hidden there long ago by Pablo's accountant, who had been arrested before he could retrieve it. Pablo summons Fernando and Kiko, accuses them of stealing the money, and ignores their protests of innocence. Enraged, Pablo beats Fernando to death and orders his men to kill Kiko as well. They burn and dispose of the bodies, an unjust fate for two loyal men. Meanwhile, Navigante meets with Pacho and informs him about the killings, suggesting they pass this intel to Javier and Murphy to help get Pablo moved to a real prison. Javier and Murphy realize Cesar won't act on his own, so they leak the story to the press to pressure him. The next day, all the news outlets report that Pablo Escobar killed 2 men inside prison and is living in luxury, sparking outrage. Javier and Murphy celebrate but are soon summoned by the ambassador, who informs them they are suspended and under investigation for leaking classified information without authorization. They are stunned but have no choice. Later, as Murphy returns home, he is kidnapped by Pacho's men along with Navigante. Pacho plays a recording of Murphy illegally collaborating with Carrillo and threatens to expose him unless he cooperates. Murphy is released and recounts everything to Javier, who angrily accuses him of leaking the story, but Murphy denies it. Javier then meets Navigante at a bar, revealing he has indeed been working with Pacho's group. The season ends as President Cesar, upon learning of the killings in prison, decides to transfer Pablo to a real prison. He sends a special army unit led by a man named Ariza to arrest Pablo. The unit raids the prison, killing Pablo's men and rescuing Eduardo. But they find no sign of Pablo, only a tunnel beneath the prison. Pablo and his men have already escaped into the jungle. And that's how the season ends. Pablo has outsmarted everyone. And the war between him and the government is far from over.